Hello, this is Kate Goldblum with the New Mexico Nurse Practitioner Council. The science of COVID-19 is a topic with new information emerging constantly. NMNPC is very pleased to have Dr. Fred Fox presenting with the most current information on this topic. Dr. Fox?
Thank you, Kate. I'd like to thank the New Mexico Nurse Practitioner Council for giving me this opportunity to present to you. A little bit about my background. I am essentially a lifelong resident of New Mexico with periods spent away for education and training. After undergraduate, I obtained a master's in science and ecology, and that's contributed to my self-characterization as a lifelong committed science nerd. I obtained a medical degree at the University of New Mexico, and then that was followed by a family practice residency at Duke University. And many years later, I obtained a public health certificate from New Mexico State. My wife, Patty, and I have been residents of Grant County, where Silver City is located, for the last 33 years and raised our sons there. I practiced family practice for many years and then left and when my children were in their teen years to spend more time with them. Subsequently, I worked in Arizona, commuting there on a weekly basis to administer the clinic there, and I also was the medical director of the public health department. There I've been involved in a collaboration since March of last year on the planning and response to the COVID-19 pandemic. My goal today is to provide information on the vaccine, but my hope is that this information will help individuals to make their own decision to be vaccinated. I recognize that I have a dual audience today. There's those of you who are providers, and also perhaps your patients if you choose to share this video with them. So therefore, while I'm going to try to explain the science in a manner understandable to those patients of yours, I recognize that the material is also appropriate and be appreciated at a different level by you. So today I'll be talking about the virus SARS-CoV-2 and the disease it causes COVID-19. I'm going to talk about how we as humans respond to viral illness and to vaccines. I'm going to talk about the new COVID vaccines, the vaccines themselves, and also how the vaccine alone is not going to get us out of this pandemic. So here you see a rendition of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. It's an envelope virus. It's surrounded by a mixture of proteins with the protuberance of the spike protein, which gives it its name in the category of coronavirus. That spike protein is important. We'll be talking about it more later. Inside this envelope virus is the genetic material. It's a single strand of RNA encapsulated and stabilized within there by nucleocapsid proteins. The genome inside is a simple genome. Next slide. Here represented by a single strand or single line of around 30,000 nucleotide bases. This compares to the human genome of about 3 billion bases. So they're around 100,000 times larger. The RNA makes basically proteins. That's all it can do, translates to proteins. On the left are some of the enzymes, which are one type of protein that are produced that regulate the functioning. And on the right in the green are those structural proteins that encompass the proteins on the envelope of this virus. The large one there, the spike protein, is the one we're going to talk about mostly today. You can see a diagram in the lower left there, another cross-section of the virus with a spike protein on the outside, that strand of single-stranded RNA inside the envelope surrounded by the nucleocapsid proteins. Coronaviruses exist in nature as infections or inhabiting many different animals. There tends to be a single strain per group of animals, but there are 7 that have been zoonotic. In other words, they've crossed over from their animal hosts into humans. Next slide. 4 of these, you can see the coronavirus represented on the left. The next column is their natural host. The ones that infect humans, their natural hosts are either rodents or bats. But they go through a series of intermediate hosts before they finally reach a point where they are potentially transmissible to humans, but also are existing in an animal with which we can interact, such as agricultural animals, animals that we encounter in the wild or in our homes, or that we eat and hunt. On the right is the years when these strains were first identified. The top 4 are the 4 common cold coronaviruses. These never kill anybody unless you happen to sneeze while you have one and drive off the road and into a tree. They are a very mild illness. Consequently, we don't make a very good immune response to them. We don't have to. And also, because they cause mild disease and our immune response is not great to them, we can get them in the same year a couple of times. Kids can sometimes be infected with the coronavirus at the start of the winter season and get the same one again at the end. There have been, you can see the top one there with a cow, that was first identified, is now through genetic genome, sequencing the genome and looking at genetic clocks, that first emerged around 1890 as an epidemic in the United States at that time, crossed from cattle to humans. The other 4, one came from an alpaca, the others, the intermediate hosts, are not identified. But since the turn of this century, there have been 3 that have emerged, which are much more virulent. The first in 2003 was the first SARS epidemic. It was crossed over probably from a ring-tailed dog, a raccoon dog, in about 2003. It was quite virulent. About 15% of patients who were stricken with this virus died, but it was not very transmissible, and public health measures of contact tracing, isolation, and quarantine allowed the outbreak to be controlled. In 2012, the MERS emerged, and this probably came from camels, and this was even more deadly. About 40% of people died who contacted it, but again was not very transmissible. But in 2019, emerging probably from a pangolin, a spiny anteater, although this is not at all clear yet, was the disease that we're now experiencing, the SARS-CoV-2 virus and the COVID-19 pandemic. It is also more deadly than the common cold coronavirus, with 1, perhaps 2% of people dying who obtain it, but certainly in certain populations, it's much more virulent, especially in nursing home residents, elderly persons, and persons living in poverty and socially disadvantaged. Next slide. This shows the number of cases and deaths. I didn't update this slide. This is from about 3 weeks ago when I gave another version of this talk. But you can see on the left upper, the number of cases increasing over the last year. They now totaled close to 30,000 in the United States. Below that is the daily case rate, and shows an increase in the spring, another uptake in the summer, and then a dramatic increase this last fall. It has since started to drop off a bit. On the right is the same information for the number of deaths, rising steadily through the year with an increase this past fall. And you can see the daily case rate below that. There was increases in the spring, some increase in the summer, and then a dramatic increase in the fall and winter. Next slide, please. These deaths that have occurred, over 500,000 of them now in the United States. If you compare these to other significant periods of death in our country, for example, the so-called Spanish flu that occurred from around February of 2018 to May of 1918 to May of 1920, there were an estimated 675,000 deaths in the US. In World War II, there were about 405 deaths occurring among US servicemen and servicewomen during the slightly less than 4 years of the war. The greatest the most deadly U.S. conflict was the Civil War. And during those 4 years, an estimated 655,000 Americans died. Compare this to the 1 year, a single year of the COVID-19 pandemic, when more than 500,000 people have died. By the time this pandemic is controlled, it will have exceeded all those other periods of significant death. But in addition to that death, there's been loss of educational opportunity and continuity, disruption of our medical care and medical services, economic upheaval, much more poverty and widening of the wealth gap, an increase in family disruption, and other major consequences, which has torn the social fabric of our country and caused tremendous grief and sorrow. And this impact has been disproportionately felt by people of ethnic minorities, those living in poverty, and other disadvantaged groups who are already the victims of structural and overt racism and classism. Next slide. So what have we done about it? Well, we're providers. We try to medically intervene. There have been various claims for drugs, vitamins, and various supplements in terms of prevention and early treatment. These are largely anecdotal, however, and oftentimes linked to some group that has that might financially benefit from it. The studies that do exist have been small, they lack rigor, and they're often contradictory. Recently, just this last week, there was some larger studies showing that vitamin C and zinc were not effective. There have been efforts to treat with drugs for early in hospitalized treatment. Hydroxychloroquine showed initial or suggested initial promise, and I was hopeful for that. But numerous large-scale studies have shown that it does not help at all at any stage in the illness. Some drugs, such as Regeneron and Remdesivir, which were used to treat President Trump, and also convalescent plasma, have been shown to benefit earlier in the course, but the benefits really only result in shortened hospitalizations. They don't affect the mortality rate. They're expensive, they're not widely used. In patients who are sick enough to be hospitalized on oxygen or a ventilator, simple steroids, dexamethasone, which has been around for quite some time, is inexpensive. They are the only drugs that have been shown to reduce deaths. A recent Canadian study claimed in a press release that colchicine also does this. But this is medicine by press release, and I don't believe in that. Until we actually get peer-reviewed study published, it's difficult to evaluate these claims. Yet survival has improved over the course of our treatment. This has largely been because of more effective nursing care and also the supportive care, such as things as proning, where the patient is laid on their abdomen for much of the day, which helps alleviate some of the pressure on the lung, and they can ventilate better. They've learned to manage ventilators better, and also to treat and prevent some of the complications, such as clots that form by using anti-clotting agents. Yet all of these interventions treat the patient who is already ill and already infected, and they don't really reduce the transmission to new individuals. Additionally, long COVID syndrome or long hauler syndrome, goes by a number of names, is becoming a major health issue. We're uncertain about the long-term consequences of this, but you as nurse practitioners will undoubtedly see patients who have many of these longer-term symptoms. They can be involved in cardiac. We know that it's maybe predisposing people to future development of heart failure, respiratory problems, neurologic problems, renal and liver, and other issues as well. So it's been the long-awaited vaccines and the continuation of public health measures, which have really been the primary means to reduce transmission and bring this pandemic under control. And they can do that by decreasing the R0 to less than 1. Next slide. So what is this R0? Well, what it is the reproduction number, and it basically indicates how many people are subsequently being infected. In other words, one person who's ill during the course of their illness infects another person. So if you have 1,000 people, when the R value is 1, that 1,000 people during the course of their illness will infect another 1,000, who in turn infect another 1,000. So the number of cases never goes up. But in a pandemic such as we're in, the R value is greater than 1. So if it's 2, that 1,000 people infect 2,000, who in turn infect 4,000, and then 8, etc. And the pandemic increases in the number exponentially. If an R value is less than 1, that 1,000 people infect 900, then 800, etc. And the pandemic comes under control. Next slide, please. So many of you, when you're in high school or college, may have had assignments where you had a paper due on some lengthy book you had to read. You just never quite got around to reading it. So at the last minute, you used Monarch Notes or Cliff Notes, a little synopsis to write that paper. You probably didn't get an A, but maybe you passed. Well, I'm going to talk about our immune response to infection, specifically to virus. It's an incredibly complex field. It's rich, rapidly changing. So I'm going to give you the Fred Notes version. Basically, we have 2 fundamental responses that allow us to combat viruses that have breached our other defenses, the mucus, for example, in our nasal passages, and are initiating infection. The first is a fairly rapid response. It occurs within minutes to hours. It's termed innate immunity, and it's a nonspecific response to any pathogen, to any virus. And it involves physical changes such as a swelling and increasing our temperature, which can have detrimental effects on the virus and also cause other compounds to be brought to the area. Bioactive chemicals are produced, cytokines and chemokines, which can have negative effects on the virus itself. And then a whole host of various cells which can destroy, coat, engulf, and digest pathogens. But there's also communication from this innate system to the other type of immunity. And once that occurs, this more specific response can develop over a slower time period of hours to days. But it's termed adaptive immunity, and it's a more specific and stronger defense, and it produces both antibodies and also very aggressive antiviral cells, which have really cool names like natural killer cells, which are actually part of the innate system, and also cytotoxic T cells. And these cells do much to eliminate the viral particles themselves or cells infected, our own cells infected with the virus. But this adaptive immunity system also has a capacity of what's termed immunological memory, which permits in the future, when there's individuals exposed to a subsequent infection by the same virus, a very rapid and strong response. And in addition, there's a lot of communication and cooperation that exists between the bioactive chemicals, the physical changes, the cellular response, the humoral or antibody response, and feedback between the adaptive and the innate immunity. Next slide, please. So that was the Fred Notes version of immunology, but I want to talk specifically about the antibody response. And that there are 2 general basic types. The first is a non-neutralizing antibody. These are antibodies that can latch on to some part of the viral envelope. For example, or in the case of the spike protein, perhaps to the base of the spike protein. And they essentially act like beacons or warning lights saying, there's a bad actor here. I want all the rest of you to come in here and help me with this. And so it elicits a whole response to that because of these signaling antibodies that are there. They can also help coat the virus or coat the infected cells. They can release compounds that bore through and digest them. So those are the non-neutralizing antibodies. Then there's a second group of antibodies, the neutralizing antibodies, which are very important. They have the ability to block the virus from entering the cell and infecting it and block it from replicating. So this is real important in stopping the infection. Next slide. So here we see again a rendition of the SARS-CoV-2 virus on the bottom with its spike protein, and at the top is one of our cells, a human cell that's the host, with the ACE2 receptor. I'll get to that in a minute. If you look on the right and ignore the antibody, the yellow-green on the top, Y-shaped antibody on the top, ignore that for the moment, and just look at the purple, silver, and red spike protein. The red area is or RBD is the receptor binding domain, and this is analogous to a key. The key goes into the lock of the ACE2 inhibitor, ACE2 receptor, and when it's turned, there's actually allows the viral genetic material to enter the host. When these two areas, when the RBD binds to the ACE2 receptor, there's actually a geometric change in that in that spike protein, which opens a passageway from the viral envelope into the host cell and allows that RNA to go into the host cell, where it then takes over the manufacturing capability of our cell to produce hundreds and thousands of copies of the virus, which then destroy that cell, released to go on and infect others. Going back to the view on the right, a neutralizing antibody, which this one is, binds to that receptive binding domain, that key, if you will. It's like your 5-year-old taking your car key and pouring super glue all over the end of it. It's not going to start your car. It'll never fit in that key. So this blocks the virus from attaching to the host, from entering the host and replicating. But it can't eliminate it alone, because eventually that antibody can come off. It's dependent on all the other cellular responses, all the other immunological responses to come help it, so that it comes and engulfs and breaks down the virus and any host cells in which the virus is infected. Next slide, please. So vaccines produce essentially the same kind of response. So our immunity after vaccination occurs in the same fashion, and they generally provide some degree of long-term protection. And that's because of the ability of those memory cells, the memory B cells, which make antibodies, and memory T cells, which make all those different cell types that can respond and rapidly respond to re-exposure. When we look at traditional vaccines, such as influenza or measles, they all contain viral particles. They're basically virus that have either been weakened significantly or killed, so they can't replicate, or the virus has been broken apart into parts. We call them split vaccines, split viral vaccines. They're then prepared, injected into your muscle, and elicit the same immune response. Measles vaccine is quite effective, very effective, up in the 90 percentile, while influenza is not as effective, only 50 to 60%, but it still is enough to prevent numerous deaths every year. Influenza mutates so rapidly that we're always a step or two behind it, and it's why we have to get a different version every year. Now, that differs from the messenger RNA vaccines that we're seeing now that are being produced to combat COVID-19. These vaccines induce an immunological response to a single viral protein, that spike protein, which your own muscle cells produce during that brief period when a small piece of the genetic code or message, not the actual gene itself from the virus, but the replication of it, essentially like a 3D printer that they've made in the manufacturing of it, that produces that protein in your muscle cell. But both the RNA and the protein are rapidly broken down and eliminated. Now, messenger RNAs, people ask, are they safe? They're so new. There was this rapid approval of them. Well, in fact, they've been investigated for a long time. Over the last decade or more, they've been investigated, and vaccines were actually developed for Ebola and Zika just both of those pandemics had waned by the time they were ready to do larger studies. It's currently being used to investigate influenza vaccines, and it's been used for rabies vaccine, but there's never enough rabies cases to warrant, and it's also ethically problematic to have a placebo, that there's never enough cases to use into the study. Right now, there's another outbreak of Ebola in Guinea, and the World Health Organization has released 2 different versions of messenger RNA vaccines to combat that. Next slide. So how does this messenger RNA vaccine actually work? Well, on the left, you can see a diagram of a typical human cell, the one in pink there. On the left of that is that circle that represents our nucleus, and in it is our genetic material, the DNA. Typically, if in that cell, or any of the 37 trillion cells that inhabits that each of you has in your body, typically when one of those cells is making proteins, the DNA will release a strand of messenger RNA that goes through a one-way valve, essentially, into the cytoplasm, where it then, in every cell of those 37 trillion right now, you're making hundreds to thousands of proteins every second. It's an incredibly complex and well-regulated system. The cellular metabolism has evolved over hundreds of millions of years and is so efficient and is so regulated, there's almost no opportunity for error. If you think about it, with all that activity going on, there can't be any error, or there'd be just chaos. So it's well regulated. So when you receive a vaccine with a messenger RNA, that copy, the 3D printer essentially copy of the gene for the spike protein. That's all that's there. It's not the rest of the viral genetic information. That's encapsulated in fats and polyethylene glycol and injected into your arm. Some of that is absorbed into the muscle cell, and the messenger RNA rapidly makes some protein. On the right, you see how that occurs. That white object is a ribosome, the protein manufacturing organelle in the cell. The blue is some messenger RNA. It's being read as it strips through there very fast, and amino acids are chained together in that black and red line to make the protein, in this case, the spike protein. Next slide. So once it's there, what happens to that messenger RNA? Well, within a few hours, it's broken down into tiny particles and no longer functions. The spike protein, though, which is made by the muscle cells when you've received the vaccine, is released either into the bloodstream, where it circulates and causes many of the widespread symptoms that we get from the vaccine, or right on the surface of the muscle cell, and elicits an extremely strong immune response, resulting in your symptoms of the vaccination. Within a few days, actually within a couple of days, that spike protein is completely broken down and eliminated from your system. Our immune systems are incredibly effective at removing all these foreign particles from our system. With the second vaccination, our immune reaction is quicker and stronger due to that booster effect of the memory B cells and memory T cells, and so our symptoms are likely to be stronger as well. But no introduced material is left. Our immunological response is so efficient and so good, it's completely eliminated. But yet people wonder about, well, isn't that messenger RNA somehow getting into my DNA and impacting it? No, it doesn't do that. In the first place, it's broken down into very small parts rapidly. Secondly, it can't enter the nucleus because there's really no way to get back through that one-way valve. If by chance it did, humans lack the ability to reverse engineer that RNA into their own DNA. They lack what's called an RNA reverse transcriptase. But to muddy the waters, over the last several 100 million years of our evolution, we have actually incorporated viral DNA, viral genetic information, DNA, into our own chromosomes, into our own DNA. It represents about 8 to 10% of the DNA in our own system. It was evidently incorporated hundreds of million years ago and essentially inactivated, although some of those have been repurposed and we actually use the proteins they make for other purposes. Next slide. So what about these vaccines that are being released? The two that are out there right now are the Pfizer and the Moderna. They're 95% effective. That's a little misleading. It means that 5% of the people who have had it might get a mild or moderate case of COVID. But the important part here is in the almost 100,000 people in the phase 3 trials who received all the doses of the vaccine and all the different messenger RNA types that were studied. In those nearly 100,000 people that started being vaccinated last spring and are currently still of course, receiving those vaccines now. The number of people who got sick enough to require severe hospitalization was 0. The number of people who had received all their vaccinations who died out of that 100,000 people was 0. In other words, these are incredibly effective at preventing serious illness and death. If they cause some mild illness, well, so what? It's really death and serious hospitalization we want to prevent. So the Pfizer and Moderna are very similar, but the Pfizer requires ultra cold storage. So mostly it isn't sent to rural or smaller communities, although there is a little R2D2-like freezer thing that they can send where a few doses can be used for a few days. But generally, they're both two injections, Pfizer 21 days apart, Moderna 28. The only contraindications are basically if you have a known allergy to the components. How do you know that? You reacted to the first one. Or the polyethylene glycol in it, which is in Miralax, a stool agent. If you react to that, you probably shouldn't take the vaccine. If you've had COVID in the last 2 weeks and haven't recovered, you shouldn't have it. If you received another vaccination within 2 weeks before, you shouldn't receive it. They generate strong immune system symptoms. They're similar in both. The injection site, a lot of soreness, fatigue, headache, muscle pain, joint pain, and fever. They're very similar between both of them. Next slide. Now, there are other vaccines on the horizon. In the United Kingdom, the Oxford AstraZeneca has been approved, and you've probably heard of the Johnson & Johnson, a single-dose vaccine that the U.S. is evaluating. These are similar. They're both messenger RNA vaccines, but instead of a fatty coating around them to protect them, it's an adenovirus, another cold virus that's been weakened. They essentially don't have any of its own genetic material inside. Instead, there's been another one of these manufactured genes for the spike protein inside it. And it's just the vessel by which it gets into your cells. So it's a weakened virus. It's unable to replicate, but it contains that genetic code for the spike protein. And like any messenger RNA, it produces a very strong immunological response that results in immunity from other infection. They both provide good efficacy against serious COVID disease and death, and they both have good safety profiles. There is perhaps a little less effectiveness in older adults, but that's not in terms of preventing death, maybe just in terms of preventing some of the moderate illness. And the Johnson & Johnson is awaiting a February 26th meeting of the Vaccine Advisory Committee to the FDA and likely will be approved. So the important question is, which of these vaccines should I give? Which one's better? Which one's better for me? You take whatever one you have the opportunity to take first, because they're all incredibly effective and they will most likely protect you from dying or from serious illness. Next slide. Now, as the medical director in Greenlee County, Arizona, it was decided by others that I should take the first dose of the vaccine when they arrived in December. I think most of that is because they thought I was an old guy and I needed protection. But the other part was because I'm well known in that community and they wanted publicly for people to see that I felt it was safe. So it was done publicly on video and I answered questions. One of the nurses has a YouTube channel was put out there. Excuse me, just a little tuberculosis there. And it was put on her YouTube channel. In a few days, it had been viewed about 250 times. Another provider, a physician assistant, has a Facebook page, and she had questions posed to me during the video, and I responded to those, and it surprised me because by a few days later, 2,500 people had viewed that. I don't participate in any of the anti-social media, so that blew me away. Had I realized that, though, I'd have paid more attention to my hair and makeup, and maybe been able to get away with come away with some product endorsements, lucrative ones, I would hope. But that didn't happen. Next slide. So I got that first dose on December 21st. Had my bags packed. We were waiting for the arrival. We got news that it got in about 1:30, and a half hour later, I kissed Patty goodbye and I was on the road. That evening, I received the first dose publicly on December 21st. I got moderate arm tenderness, which was present for 2.5 days, and I got a mild headache that night at bedtime. I got my booster on Tuesday, January 19th, 29 days later, about 4 p.m., again in Arizona. Then I drove home. That evening, I had some body aches and some arm soreness by bedtime. Overnight, I got a mild headache, got joint pain began, and my body aches worsened. I didn't sleep very well. By Wednesday in the morning, I had episodes of shaking chills, then was just chilled throughout much of the day. My temperature was 99.7. I felt fatigued and run down, and that discomfort and the headache worsened. Overnight, the headache persisted, the chill feeling was still there, my temperature was still mildly elevated, 99.8. I had joint pain and body aches, they continued. I still wasn't sleeping well, so about midnight, I took an over-the-counter pain reliever. About 4:30, I woke to drive back to Arizona to get more vaccines and felt some fatigue, minimal body discomfort, and all that resolved during the morning. But overall, I was pretty pathetic and whiny. Patty told me to just tough it out. She had some headache, some muscle aches and pains, but she'd been through childbirth a couple times. It was nothing compared to that. But I knew that my immune response had responded as it should, and I was pleased about that. Next slide. But what about all we hear about all these dangerous vaccines? Can't they cause all kinds of problems? Well, let's compare them to the other medical interventions that are common. What about surgery? Well, surgery has been described as receiving a medieval wound from a medieval broadsword, but now done by a highly trained group under sterile conditions using sterile stainless steel instruments. Big wounds, what are the side effects of that? You're laid low for a while. You have pain. You have a prolonged period of healing. You require rehabilitation and gradual resumption of your activities. You have loss of income and loss of work ability. You may have some infrequent complications of infections or damage to another organ or even death. What about the anesthesia that's necessary when you're put to sleep? This is not some cuddly big bear of an anesthesiologist who rocks you to sleep. No, they give you 2 drugs. The first one's a paralytic agent because the surgeon doesn't want you moving while they're operating on you. So right away, you can't open your eyes, you can't breathe, you can't talk, you can't move. So the anesthesiologist has to give you oxygen and possibly put a tube down to breathe for you. You can't breathe, you can't talk, you can't tell anybody you can't do this. It's terrifying. So they give you another drug, a sedative, to put you to sleep. These can cause depression, they can cause other problems. The combination of these drugs can interfere with your blood pressure. It may fall, you have to give fluids, drugs to bring it up. Your blood pressure may go up, you give drugs to bring it down. Your temperature may go up or down, that has to be managed. Your heart rate, same thing can happen and go all over. So basically an anesthesiologist is an expert, a specialist in managing side effects, which is what anesthesia is. What about drugs and medication? Most of you have had those. You're all aware of some of the side effects. drugs and medication are only 20 to 30% effective. If I have a there's no drugs that I can give you 2 weeks that cures your diabetes or your hypertension or your heart disease. If you have a blood sugar averaging 200, and I give you a drug that will reduce it by 20 or 30%, in other words, it's 20 to 30% effective, that brings your blood sugar down 40 to 50 points down to around 140, 100 to 160. I'm pretty happy with that. But all drugs have side effects. There's depression. There's erectile dysfunction with some. There's low blood pressure. There is cough with ACE inhibitors. There is electrolyte disturbances, impact on your kidneys or your liver. There are many common side effects of drugs, but we take them all the time for our various ailments. And what about those dangerous vaccines? Okay, these vaccines that we're taking right now for COVID are 95% effective, 100% effective against death. That's pretty darn good. What about the side effects? Well, they're immune effects, not side effects. All vaccines can have, after you've given millions of them, you discover rare, infrequent side effects, such as Guillain-Barré syndrome and things like that, which may occur in 1 or 2 out of a million or few million people. But I will take any vaccine that has gone through phase 3 trials and been approved by the FDA, because I know it's going to be one of the most effective things I can do. And then finally, what's this about this herd immunity thing? Well, herd immunity is when a large percentage of the population has immunity, has antibodies and these cellular responses that protect them from infection. It requires maybe 80, 85% of the population doing that. There's 2 ways to get it. You either give vaccines and get enough people immune, or you let them all get sick. So what's this herd immunity thing? There's no herd immunity fairy who goes along and goes, ding, you're immune. Ding, you're immune. She's a lot more sinister than that when you're doing it by illness. The herd immunity fairy is then going, ding, you've got serious COVID. You're going to be hospitalized probably for a long time. If you survive, you're going to have complications for a long time, probably. Ding, you've got moderate disease. Oh, you're probably going to have problems. You're going to miss a lot of work. Your family's going to probably get sick too. Ding, you're not going to have any symptoms at all. You'll never know when you pass on COVID to someone else who will get sick and possibly die. So that's the real impact of herd immunity by allowing infection. The next slide, please. So I want to give you a little bit of information about mask use. There are 4 basic types of masks, or 5 really. There's the bandana or the face gaiter, which is not very effective. It's thin, it's a single layer, it really doesn't block much. And then there are 3 types of medical masks. The procedure mask, which is what many of you can actually buy in the drugstore. And you can tell it because it's got ear loops. It's got a little metal piece at the top. It can be formed around your nose. Loops go over your ears. The problem with it is they tend to have gaps on the side. So you can get air moving in and out, possibly with viral particles there. Then I don't have an example of a surgical mask. Those are worn in the operating room. They tend to look similar to this, but they have either 4 ties that are tied around or 2 loops like this that go up. Those are used by staff in the operating room to prevent infecting the open wound or to picking up things themselves. And the final is an N95 mask, which is this is one that we have over in Arizona. It was issued a decade ago by FEMA. They're actually outdated, but they still work fine. The reason they are outdated is the elastic tends to give away on them. These seal around the nose, under the chin, and seal tightly to the edge. So they completely block viral particles going either way. You're wearing a mask to protect you. You want someone else who's infected wearing a mask to protect you so they don't breathe out on you. And finally, there's cloth masks. And these, if there are multiple layers, are very effective. This kind has a little opening where you can put some filter paper or something else in there if you wish to make it more effective. It's got ear loops. It fits over. And you see it fits better on the side. So you're not getting air coming in and out. An effective way of doing this is to use a procedure mask, which, by the way, should only be used probably one time and then thrown away. And be aware of buying things on the internet unless you're absolutely certain of the supplier. If you buy these masks in your drugstore, they're probably appropriate because there's a lot of fakes out there that aren't appropriate. But if you wear this, as you see they're doing in the White House now, and then to protect this, they wear a cloth mask over it, which pushes it down on the edge and provides much better protection. Now, what about people wearing these masks? That is an ineffective mask. You may as well not be wearing it. You're still getting viral particles that can get into your nose. You may be protecting your chin or beard from COVID, but that's not very important. The other problem with these is you see people constantly grabbing the mask and adjusting it, moving it down to talk, up, moving it around because it bothers them. The outside is contaminated with virus. That's why you're wearing it. Don't touch it. You just got it all over your hand. So don't play with your mask. Next slide. So what are the best practice recommendations to end this pandemic? And these are my best practice recommendations too. First, foremost, get vaccinated with whichever vaccine you get first offered. Continue to correctly wear a quality, well-fitting mask and stop playing with it. Practice social distancing. Avoid larger groups. Avoid closed spaces, especially in places that don't have good ventilation, and wash your hands frequently. And you may save the life of someone you love. Next question, or next slide. So now I'll be happy to take some questions. I think Kate may have some, and then we have another way to answer some of them.
Yeah, we have a few questions that have come in that we'd like to have you address. The first one is, what's the current thinking regarding everyone getting one shot of the vaccine before moving on to giving people their second shot? Is that going to be something that we should consider?
Can you switch off the screen share too? Yeah, that's an excellent question. And there's been a lot of talk about that, and politicians and even some scientists and medical people have talked about it. And in some European countries, they've made the decision to do that. The problem with it is the research wasn't done with these two vaccines on a single dose. They did note that there was some improvement in antibody response and all after the first dose, but everybody virtually got the second dose, except for a few people lost to follow-up. So they don't really know what the effect of just a single dose is. They only know the effect of two doses, and that effect is very good. We know it protects against death and serious hospitalization. So it's essentially a gamble or a crapshoot. They are looking at that and trying to evaluate it, but until such time as there's good data, we should stick with the recommendations of most of the experts of getting both doses of the vaccine. There is a window of when you can get it. For example, with the Moderna, you can get it 4 days before the 28-day recommended and up to 2 weeks after. And the same essentially with the Pfizer as well, 4 days before the 21 and 2 days thereafter.
Thank you. Here's another one. What's happening with the new strains of coronavirus that are emerging?
Those are worrisome, and people have read a lot about them. There are several strains that came out, the B1 351 in England, which is now widespread in the US and is likely to become the most common strain. The B1, I'm blanking on the name, in South Africa, which is also, and then the P1 in Brazil. All of these are much more transmissible. There are mutations that have occurred on that receptor binding proportion of the spike protein that allow it to more easily attach to our receptors on our cells and transmit the viral genetic material. They also allow it to evade somewhat the effect of the neutralizing antibodies, which bind to that receptor binding domain. However, we know that there are such high levels of the neutralizing antibody produced by 2 doses or by all the recommended doses of these vaccines that even if it's reduced somewhat, it's felt that that's still adequate to really perform an effective job of neutralizing, allowing the other responses, immunological responses, to act. One way to look at this is to look at what are the things, the components of a virus or the attributes of a virus that need to occur in order for it to become a pandemic virus, to cause a pandemic. First, a virus has to be transmissible. So it has to have a way of it has to be transmissible. It has to be virulent. Transmissible, has to be infectious, has to be virulent, and have a pathogenicity. And I'll go over all this. To be transmissible, the SARS virus is like that. It has to be able to be maintained in a reproducible state when it's present on the air, flowing out in the air, so it can transmit it into your nostrils when it gets there, or to survive on a surface long enough that you touch it and then touch your face. So that's transmissible. But if it's transmissible but gets into your nose but can't really infect it, it's not enough. So it has to have a way of infecting you too. And that's where the spike protein comes in. It binds, it opens up that passageway and lets you get in. But once it's in, it's not enough unless it's virulent. It has to cause sufficiently severe disease over a prolonged enough period that you're going to make more copies of it and transmit it out. You're going to release the virus into the atmosphere or into the environment to transmit to other people. And finally, pathogenicity. You want it to be cause enough serious disease to allow many people to get sick and transmit it. But you don't want too many people dying, or you don't get very good transmission. So you have to have a sweet spot there. And the SARS-CoV-2 has hit that sweet spot. We have a small number of people who die. Well, it's not insignificant at all, but 1% to 2%. But everybody else is sick enough to transmit large amounts of the virus. So what's happening with these strains is they're able to evade somewhat some of the immune responses and thus be more transmissible. We don't know yet whether they're going to be more virulent or more pathogenic. There may be some evidence it is, but from evolutionary theory, it predicts that actually they should get weaker but more transmissible, much like the common coronaviruses are. So it's the jury's still out on how significant they are, other than they are going to be more transmissible, and we may need to come up with some booster vaccines to do it. And Moderna's already just today was talking about they are testing some currently.
Thank you. This is a question that I've had posed to me a number of times. Now that people are getting vaccinated, they're wondering what they can do. They say, well, I'm vaccinated, I'm 2 weeks out past mine, so I'm the best situation possible for me. Is it reasonable now to get together with other people in smaller groups, say maybe less than 10 or somewhere around there, if they're also vaccinated and in the same status?
If you're around other adults who've been vaccinated, because remember, children aren't eligible to be vaccinated yet. and you've all been fully vaccinated, your risk of becoming ill is quite low. But you can still catch and be infected. Dr. Fauci talked about it as you can become infected, but not necessarily have the illness. In other words, there's nothing, these vaccines respond or act only after you contract the virus. It's not an invisible force shield out, the equivalent of a backyard bug zapper out there protecting you. It's only after you catch the virus that your immune system protects you. So there is a theoretical time in there where you could produce enough virus to potentially infect someone else. So yes, you probably can get together in very limited, smaller groups with other people, adults who are vaccinated, but you still ought to be using following the other public health mitigation measures of masking, social distancing, etc. With kids, it's a little different story because they tend not to get as sick. Their death rate is much lower, but they can transmit the disease. And so children may pick it up in those situations and then transmit it to someone else out of it. So it's not the end yet, but as we get more people vaccinated, we will see the ability to resume a more normal life.
Thank you.
But it's not the get out of jail free card that we all hoped it might be. Not yet.
Not yet. That's the good news. I have one last question that I realized has also come up several times that people have asked me about. They say, oh, I got my vaccine and I was, had symptoms similar to what you described when you got yours. And other people that say, oh, I didn't have any side effects at all, any symptoms following my vaccine. Does that mean it's not working?
No, it does not. That simply reflects that we are very different people. There's a lot of variation in humans and in terms of our response and many different things that can impact that. What we do know from the phase 3 studies that even people who had chronic illnesses that might cause some degree of immune suppression, even in those people, they had very good immune responses. And furthermore, none of those people got severe disease enough to be hospitalized or die. So even though you may respond in different ways, like my wife Patty had mild symptoms, I was whiny and had them all. Her response was not necessarily any less than mine. The response you do get is simply a sign that your immune system is telling you it's going to work, but it's not the only thing that's happening. And people who don't respond, and people who are elderly tend to not have as strong as symptoms. Younger people do tend to have more symptoms, but they're all protected.
Well, thank you. We have been very lucky to get you to do this for us, and we really appreciate it. There were some other questions that were posed, and we've got a document with your answers to that'll be linked on the NMNPC website. If anyone wants that, you can also request that link by emailing contact@nmnpc.org. So thank you very much, Dr. Fox, and we really appreciate this.
Thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed doing it. I hope you got some useful information about it. Stay safe. Get your vaccine when you can.
Thank you.